air over the Nile shimmers in the heat as the first light of dawn glances off the river. Somewhere along its bank, a young man wakes on a reed mat, muscles aching, a thin band of linen, his only garment. He is not a pharaoh, not a priest, not even a farmer who owns his plot. He is property, a buck, a servant bought with coin or captured in war, bound to another man's household. Yet his heart beats, he loves, he dreams. Have you ever wondered what it meant to live not in the gilded halls of kings, but in the shadows of the monuments? Our stories about ancient Egypt are often dominated by pharaohs and pyramids. We imagine legions of enslaved people dragging stones in chains, whipped under a merciless sun. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Today we will step into the sandals of a common slave in ancient Egypt and follow his life through dawn to darkness. What we find may challenge what we think we know about freedom and servitude. In the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian word scorching meant bound for June, the eng. We do make sure this in the ship. We were complete for the Egypt and meant bound for June scone, meant simbron that lived. In the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian meant bound for life. It was used for prisoners taken after battles in Nubia, Libya, or the Sinai. The victorious pharaohs brought these captives home and assigned them to state granaries, temple estates, or noble households. Other foreigners were bought from Mediterranean markets or handed out as gifts to officials. But being foreign was not the only way to lose freedom. Egyptians themselves could fall into bondage. Debt could drive a man or woman to sell themselves or their children to satisfy a creditor. Breaking the law could lead to a sentence of servitude. In rare cases, disgraced officials were enslaved as a form of humiliation. Egyptian texts used different words for different kinds of servants. Plural w, often referred to slaves of foreign origin, while bak described a servant or worker. These categories blurred in practice. A so-called slave might also be a trusted household administrator or soldier. During the Middle Kingdom, the satire of the trades listed the dangers of every profession, but said little about slavery. The silence suggests that slaves were not yet thought of as a separate social class. And yet the Brooklyn Papyrus records the sale of male and female servants like property, listing them as heads to be added to an estate. Our protagonist might have been born free in a small village on the flat plain. Maybe famine struck, his family borrowed grain from a wealthy landowner and could not repay. The debt sealed his fate. Or perhaps he was a teenager captured when Egyptian soldiers raided his Nubian village and marched the survivors north. However his bondage began, his name was recorded, his origin noted, and he was handed over to a master who would decide where and how he worked. The lot of a slave depended greatly on his assignment. Some were sent to the harshest places in Egypt, the turquoise mines of Sinai, the quarries of the eastern desert, or the gold mines of Nubia. There they toiled under overseers, cutting stone or digging ore in extreme heat. These operations were run like military camps, with officers drawn from the slaves' own ranks. Names were entered into registers, and branding irons the size of a finger burned state marks into skin. Modern archaeologists have found bronze branding irons from between 1292 and 656 BC, likely used to mark humans because they are far too small for cattle. A scribe wrote that such men were without heart and had to be driven with sticks. Others were assigned to temple estates. In the New Kingdom, Foreign captives replaced the royal servants and conscripts who had tilled the fields for Pharaoh and gods. They plowed with wooden plows drawn by oxen, sowed emmer and barley, harvested with flint sickles. Women spun flax into linen, wove cloth and ground grain on stone querns. They brewed beer and baked bread. Scenes in the tomb of the vizier Rekmire from about 1450 BC show brick-making gangs. One man molds mud into bricks, another carries them on his shoulders, while an overseer counts and records. At the craftsman's village of Deir el-Medina, the state provided slaves to households. The servants were paid in grain rations and could even be rented out, allowing their masters to earn additional income. Household slaves occupied a different world altogether. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, dressed their mistresses, and poured wine for guests. Some became hairdressers, shoemakers, or gardeners. Others, often foreigners with special talents, were trained as musicians, dancers, or scribes. Hieroglyphs tell us about a Nubian named Mai Perheri, whose name means lion on the battlefield. He served a pharaoh so loyally that he was rewarded with burial in the Valley of the Kings, an honor reserved for elites. 2 royal slaves under Ramesses IX held the titles Scribe to Pharaoh, Director of the property of the High Priestess of Amun, and Speaker to Pharaoh. They ranked immediately after high priests. Not all masters were cruel. Many slaves were woven into family life. A letter to the dead from the first intermediate period shows a man asking his ancestors to punish 2 housemaids who, he believes, are preventing his wife from bearing a son. He speaks of them with familiarity, showing how servants could become integral to household affairs. Another letter from the early Middle Kingdom instructs a family to expel a misbehaving servant the very day a messenger arrives. Expulsion meant loss of economic security, but not death. Slaves could be taught to read and write, and some were appointed officers over their fellows. The line between servant and member of the household was thin. Slaves, like free laborers, lived on the staples of the Nile Valley. The old Egyptian hieroglyph for meal combined the signs for bread and beer. Bread made from emmer or barley and thick, nutritious beer were daily fare. A few onions and some dried fish completed the standard ration for common people. Beer was more than a drink, it was currency. Even slaves were entitled to 2 to 3 loaves of bread and 2 crocks of beer per day. This was not a whim of a generous master, but a regulated ration. The nectar of the gods flowed down from temple breweries to the lowest of workers. The state recognized that to keep bodies working, they had to be fed. Their shelters varied. Those working in mines or quarries slept in simple huts or tents, while household slaves shared quarters near the kitchens or stables of their masters. At Deir el-Medina, the worker village on the west bank of the Nile, houses were small but solid, made of mud brick with flat roofs and courtyards. Some slaves may have shared these homes with craftsmen, their families, and other servants. Life was crowded, but community ties formed. They celebrated festivals, played board games like Senet, and told stories by oil lamp. Religion permeated their world. They wore amulets for protection, whispered prayers to their local gods, and listened to stories about journeys through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Egyptian slavery was not based on race. Foreigners were looked down upon by some Egyptians, but once enslaved, they often learned the language, adopted customs, and even married into Egyptian families. Slaves could own personal property and negotiate transactions. They could be given as inheritance or sold, but they were not tied to a piece of land like medieval serfs. Masters were obliged to feed and shelter them. A royal servant named Wajhao was taught to write by his master. Setao, an official, used foreign slaves to build a temple at Wadi es-Sebua. These slaves were paid in grain rations and sometimes earned taxable wages. They could marry, start families, and keep their original names. Some slaves even rose to prominence. Under the 19th dynasty, certain slaves attained high honors. One became a clerk of the treasury, another supervised the erection of monuments. Royal slaves Nesamun and Neferkeraemper-Amun held positions immediately below the high priests. Yet power was not guaranteed. Punishments existed. In a cautionary tale, desertion from work projects could be punished with 50 lashes for a day's absence. Branding, as we've seen, marked bodies. Servants guilty of this service could be expelled from households. And the poor child born into slavery might be raised only to be torn from his mother and beaten like a donkey when he came of age. The ancient letter laments, "He is driven, he has indeed no heart in his body." One of the most striking features of Egyptian slavery is that it could end. Emancipation came through several paths. A slave could marry a free person. In the New Kingdom, a man named Ameniu earned his freedom by marrying his owner's invalid niece. In another case, the children of a slave girl called Dienihatiri were adopted by their owner. One daughter married an overseer of stables, and any children they had were born free. Adoption was another route. A master could adopt the child of his slave, effectively raising the child as his own, conferring rights and status. Alternatively, the king himself could purify or swab a slave, a ceremonial act mentioned on Tutankhamun's restoration stele. After purification, the former slave could earn taxable wages, marry, and live much like any other Egyptian. Sometimes manumission was a reward for exceptional service. Other times it was purchased with savings. Because slaves could own property and earn grain rations, those who were not in the most brutal assignments might accumulate enough to buy their freedom. The possibility of freedom created a tension in the heart of our protagonist. He labored in the fields by day and counted his grain in the evening. He listened to stories of men who had become scribes and even officials. He saw a household slave take a wife and start a family. Hope gleamed. Yet he also saw the branding iron and heard the screams from the quarries. He knew that if he fell ill or displeased his master, his fate could shift from domestic comfort to desert hardship. The story of an Egyptian slave was not just one of suffering, but of uncertainty and constant negotiation with power. Imagine now a year when the Nile fails to flood. Fields crack, grain stores shrink, and hunger grows. The pharaoh commands more hands for irrigation projects. Our protagonist, who had been working in a noble household, is summoned by an official. His master has been rewarded with a plot of temple land, and the slave must join other servants traveling south to build dikes. It is an abrupt rupture. He must leave the kitchen where he had found relative security and join a corvée team. On the road, he meets conscripted peasants and other slaves. They march in the dust, carrying tools, singing work songs to keep time. The overseer warns that anyone who deserts will be flogged. At the worksite, the sun is relentless. Men dig channels waist deep in mud. Women and children form chains to pass baskets of earth. Mosquitoes swarm. Yet there is also camaraderie. During a brief rest, an older slave tells a story about Hathor and Ra to lighten spirits. In the evening, rations of bread and beer are distributed, and the men collapse by the water. Our protagonist thinks of the temple festivals he once served, of the incense and music, and wonders if he will ever return. Suddenly, word spreads. The king himself is traveling along the canal to inspect the works. The men stand straighter. As the royal barge glides by, the pharaoh, god king of Egypt, raises his hand in blessing. For a fleeting moment, the slave meets the gaze of the living Horus. He feels both awe and bitterness. He labors for a ruler who represents order and cosmic balance, yet his own life hangs on the whim of that ruler and his master. The tension between the grandeur of Egyptian civilization and the fragility of individual lives becomes palpable. When we picture ancient slavery, we often imagine a monolithic institution of eternal bondage. Egypt's reality was more nuanced. Yes, men and women were taken against their will, branded, exploited, and sometimes beaten. But they also ate the same bread and beer as free workers. They married, raised children, prayed to the gods, and hoped. Some rose to positions of influence. Some bought their freedom. The institution was not based on race, and it shifted over centuries from corvée labor to chattel slavery to voluntary servitude in times of famine. Economic needs and political forces shaped these variations. Our protagonist's story might end in several ways. Perhaps his master, impressed by his loyalty, adopts his child, freeing the family. Perhaps the slave marries a free woman and their children are born free. Perhaps he never leaves servitude, but his children learn to read and become scribes, moving a step up the social ladder. In any case, his life is not defined solely by suffering. It is defined by work, by relationships, by small joys and sorrows, by moments of hope and despair. It is a human life. As we step back from this life along the Nile, consider what his hands helped create. Maybe he never saw the pyramids, but he built canals that saved crops, molded bricks for tombs, spun linen for priests. Without him and others like him, there would be no temples, no cities, no civilization as we know it. His story reminds us that history is not only the tale of pharaohs and battles. It is the sum of countless ordinary lives, some free, some bound, that together shape the world. Our perception of ancient Egypt changes when we look through the eyes of those at the margins. The silent hands that baked bread, tilled soil, and poured beer kept the great machine of Egypt turning. They laughed, feared, and hoped, just as we do. By telling their story, we honor them, and we ask ourselves, in our own time, whose hands remain unseen?